Yes, I am indeed here, Robin.
Oh,
I,
bless you.
I'm a
Bless you.
coiled spring in the background. Never fear.
I was just like talking to myself then.
I think I'm being remotely muted and hidden and all sorts of things.
Indeed, yes. Yes. Well, there we are. Look at that.
There we go. Permissions have been granted. Lovely, lovely to see you properly.
Face to a name, yes. And you well?
Yeah, very well, thank you. And thank you for having me today.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Yeah, and it's really great to be, having the CRC, recently launched, being focused on the Southwest to really sort of anchor that into the Secure Southwest event seems highly appropriate.
And can I just say, isn't it fabulous to arrive at a conference as first speaker, knowing that the conference objectives have already been met? So if we all want to network, we've done that, and the rest of this is gravy now, isn't it?
Exactly right. Exactly right. Almost like we planned it.
So I'll wait from the queue for you, and I'll start screen sharing, and we'll hope the tech keeps us going through.
Yeah, if you want to pop your screen up now, and then
will do.
I think according to my clock, we're almost on the stroke of 9:30. So a couple of seconds. As soon as your screen pops up, there we are into presentation mode, and I'd rather suggest off we go. You have 30 minutes on the subject of protection and the threat landscape.
Excellent. It feels like just a minute, doesn't it, for those ever listening to Radio 4? Just multiplied 30 times for you in the audience, sadly. And well, look, thank you first of all for having me. I'm really flattering, actually, to be invited to give this opening address by the Cybersecurity Cluster and by you, Robin. Particularly so because I guess 5 months ago, if you wanted to ask anybody at all about cyber, I would have been probably the last person on your list. I'll let you give in the delegate feedback afterwards views as to whether I might still be that person. I'm rather hoping not. So I'm a serving police officer within Devon and Cornwall, seconded as a superintendent to run the Cyber Resilience Centre, which I'll talk to you more about at the tail end of this presentation. Part of the role of that centre is to brief businesses around the Southwest on a regular basis with regards to the latest threats and protections that they should be aware of to try and look after themselves. So on a fairly regular basis, we do try and pick up on themes, trends and patterns. And a lot of that background activity and that background work is what I've tried to distill into the first part of the presentation today to make sure that you are aware of what's been happening, what the big themes are from the last 12 months, the period of COVID, as far as we can ascertain them. I'm also then, Robin, as you rightly said, going to move on to talking about the Cyber Resilience Centre for a short while at the tail end, so that I can really brief you all on what that brings to the landscape, where that fits, and hopefully we can talk about synergies with the cluster as part of the discussion group. So, without further ado, let's move into the presentation and talk about the threat. The great thing about being able to give this kind of address at a conference is that I guess that no one really knows, do they? And my sense was, as I opened this up, that I could say almost anything and struggle to be proven wrong. I haven't taken that approach, but let's talk about things that we probably can agree on that will be uncontrovertible. So the first one is that if we talk about the trajectory of cybercrime, we'd probably all agree that there's something equating to a gentle upwards curve. The second thing that we'd probably agree on, and maybe this is my hiding space, is that the landscape is pretty unclear. That said, I think it is pretty reasonable to say that there are a lot of these clouds, a lot of that fog that we can remove. There are some really clear trends, and I think, and I hope, that during the course of this next 30 minutes or so, I can remove some of that fog for you. So let's talk about some of the things that we do know. And it's always good to start with some absolutely indisputable statistics. So 694, there is the number of reports that are referred across to the local police force, Devon and Cornwall, by Action Fraud on an annual basis. So these are the number of times that we're told there is something cyber related which feels as though we might be able to investigate it, do something about it. And you have to be quite gratified, don't you, that if my maths is right, that's something in the region of 50 to 60 crimes on a monthly basis. So the numbers are looking pretty low. So jolly good work, Devon and Cornwall. I've even depicted that graphically because I think when you're doing scientific numbers, it's good to pretend to give it that veneer of respectability. So the next figure, 46%. I was almost inclined to do a poll to see who knew this one. So 46% is the latest figure from the DCMS, Department of Culture, Media and Sport, in terms of the number of businesses that are attacked by cybercrime on an annual basis. So this could be simple as a phishing attempt. It doesn't necessarily have to be a successful breach of cyber defense, but nonetheless, roughly half of businesses claim that they're being attacked by cybercrime on an annual basis. And this is based on a really extensive survey annually from Ipsos Mori. So the numbers there look slightly in excess of the 694 that we've first been led to talk about. If you bear with me, I'm going to blind you with a bit more science around this. So that 46%, of that number, around a third of those businesses they say that they are attacked on at least a weekly basis, which suggests that a third of those businesses are really unlucky or really aware. And I think that the truth probably lies somewhere in between, because if a third of them being attacked weekly and a half of all businesses aren't being attacked at all, then they've got to be feeling a little bit victimized. But one thing that we can say is that that number looks big compared to 694. And also, anecdotally, it's probably moving up significantly. And we'd be talking this year, I think, more in terms of 2 out of 3 or 66%. So the latest DCMS survey, I think, is now consulting, and we should get some feedback on that soon. So here we go, graphical representation for those of you who like it, halfway up the screen, almost 46% precisely. So let's look at the final figure for this slide. $1 trillion, probably not that different in dollar exchange rates, to be fair, although I've not checked lately. So this is the figure from McAfee, which suggests that the cost to the global economy this year will be somewhere around this magnitude. So we move from not very much in Devon and Cornwall towards $1 trillion across the global economy. And I've represented this one graphically too, for the sake of completion. And the obvious conclusion, I would say this, wouldn't I, as a Devon and Cornwall serving officer, is this. So well done, everybody. We've chosen a brilliant place to be. Of course, it's possible that there are other answers, and I am prepared to countenance those too. So let's talk about some of the problems and some of the issues that might play into a slightly inaccurate figure in that foggy landscape that I started with at the outset. The first thing to say is that the National Crime Agency suggests that there's massive underreporting. It's no surprise, is it? All crime is underreported, but in terms of cyber, we guesstimate that probably about 1 to 2% of the real total is actually notified to official agencies. I guess it's also interesting to remark that if you were to look on the Action Fraud website as of today, the first thing that you will see is a banner saying effectively, please bear with us, it's difficult, it's COVID, our staff are working from home, and you're likely to suffer longer delays. So at a period where we think cyber is rising, the reporting mechanisms are actually slightly more difficult, and I think that's likely to be a disincentive for people notifying us about what's really going on. There's also, and I don't want to get desperately policey, some real issues around what the heck we mean by cybercrime. So there's the obvious distinction between cyber-enabled crime, where I simply communicate via a computer, and cyber-dependent crime, which might be something like ransomware, where the crime itself is the shutting down of your computer. And that's fine, and it feels like a technical point, but I guess I'd put a parallel to you and ask whether, if I were to send you a ransom note, we would consider that to be a postal-enabled crime. Or if I were to ask you to open the bank vault for me, we'd consider that a speech-enabled crime. And the answer is probably not. And I don't mean to be facetious with this, but so much of our activity, particularly in business circles, is now cyber-based, that actually that category of cyber crime risks becoming a big amorphous blob, because it's simply the way that we do things nowadays. In terms of catching up with that, I guess it's also true that the legal context isn't there. So if I were to again come over slightly police officer-ish, we talk about an attempted offence and an actual offence. And there are definitions of what constitutes an attempt. And it's fair to say that in cyber terms, there are a lot of grey areas. So when does that exploratory phase, that social engineering particularly, cross over in something more nefarious? Very often it might not. So again, there's another area of confusion that makes it really hard to understand the magnitude of the problem. And lastly, I suppose, to pose a remark that in general crime terms, we get around this stuff because there are a number of crimes reported, and then we do a survey instead. And that used to be called the British Crime Survey and is now called the Telephone Crime Survey of England and Wales. There's a separate survey that goes on for the business community, the Commercial Victimisation Survey, and it attempts to get into this problem around how many businesses have been attacked by cybercrime. But the reality is it's been entirely unsuccessful in doing that because, it will call a local business and say, have you been subject of a cyber attack, a phishing attack? The answer is no. But the reality is that the head office 50 miles away has seen those attacks on a daily basis. So I think the surveys are still trying to catch up. And so, gosh, I feel like I'm getting my excuses in early, but let me say it's really tough to understand the problem and to be totally clear about it. So if we start off from a point that we can't know anything at all, let me try and establish a few contextual fixes that give us a clue as to what's going on. The first thing is that in their annual report on the state of the cyber industry, DCMS talk about the cybersecurity sector revenue being up 7%. They also talk, really interestingly, about investment in the sector having doubled, more than doubled, since the previous year, which rather suggests that with a bit of lag there, those of you who are in the cyber community are seeing a real sense of busyness and starting to gear up your activities accordingly. Secondly, we know that cybercrime is one of the National Crime Agency's priorities. They don't have a lot of those. By all means, feel free to read the document. But if cybercrime is one of the main things that we're focusing on nationally, it kind of suggests that that 694 figure that I started with is being given a lot of weight, or either that or perhaps the 46% or the 1 trillion are being given a lot of weight. But it's being seen at national level, and we'll talk a bit later about Boris's announcements from yesterday as something that's really, really concerning. SIRS, I think, is a really great indicator for us. So many of you will know that the NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Centre, launched the Suspicious Email Reporting Service back in April last year, largely in response to COVID and the perceived shift of online crime-based activity. By the time of their annual report in November, they were citing 2.3 million notifications and 22,000 websites having been taken down, which kind of suggests, doesn't it, that if we have a really easy way of notifying official agencies about criminal activity, then we'll do it. And you would have to say, I would have to say, that knowledge of that is pretty low in the general public. So, gosh, we've got some really busy email correspondence there, but it suggests the problem, again, is slightly larger than 694. Europol produced a report towards the tail end of last year too, looking at the overlaps between COVID-19 and cybercrime. Interestingly, and probably unsurprisingly, didn't commit themselves to statistics in any meaningful way at all, because they're really tough, aren't they? That's what we're talking about. But what they did talk about is cybercrime being at the forefront of COVID-19 pandemic, but both in terms of people's desperation to procure PPE, their anxieties around vaccine and the like, and actually new ways of doing things and their confusion. And that might relate to the way that we're all working from home now, or that we're homeschooling, or rather were, thank goodness that's finished. So I guess the lesson from that is that where there is confusion, we have seen criminals moving into that space. And lastly, I shouldn't not mention it really, everything else, because there isn't a day that goes by where you can't do an internet search on cyber news, and I do those fairly often, and find another report about indicators flashing red and going straight upwards. Now, I think it's fair to say that the majority of data in this area is produced by cybercrime firms. So is there a case for saying it's a bit like the estate agent saying that now is a great time to buy a house? Well, I guess you could make that case, but you'd also have to recognize that the companies producing these reports are the ones that have probably a better grasp of the statistics and the reality through their constant oversight of the cyberspace than actually official agencies do, and that they do constantly reflect similar patterns. So I wanted just to briefly mention this report from the Royal United Services Institute, and it followed fairly hot on the heels of another even more critical report around the way that we were viewing cybercrime as a threat. So the report suggested, and you'll see, that we should be talking about cybercrime now as a national security concern. It followed on the heels of some prior suggestions that actually we should be doing a lot more to catch offenders rather than simply try and stop these crimes from happening and do the target hardening stuff. But actually we should be doing more to pursue offenders and bring them to justice. And it's really interesting that last year, I think we have started to see some big successes. So I might talk about the EncroChat Secure Communications Network, which took down some enormous organised crime gangs across Europe. We might talk about Emotet coming down. Interestingly, in the last week or two, and actually is a real nugget of positivity here, another network, the Sky ECC Secure Communications Network, which was taken down by police. A great way for you to talk about your drug deals in private. Sky confirmed that that network was not actually hacked, but the really happy news is that actually what they say happened is that phishing emails and phishing communications managed to get people a foothold into the network and thereby understand the criminal conversations that were taking place. And something like 28 guns were seized in one city as a single result. So I guess if there's a positive, it's that cyber can happen in both directions. And this does, I think, play very much into Boris's announcements yesterday around the centrality of cyber security and the opportunities for cyber offense as a best means of attack. So I think we can see that big strategic picture that actually the country is moving at an agency level and fairly collectively towards a position of understanding the importance of cybersecurity towards defence. I even saw, coming out of some of the coverage of Boris's speech yesterday, a suggestion that, you know, where it's sufficiently robust, a cyber attack on the UK could be met by a nuclear deterrent, which honestly, I'm not sure how likely that feels. We'll all have an individual view, but it certainly would have felt absolutely impossible to vocalize if we'd moved back 20 years ago. And it does go into the piece around cyber being a really important part of the way that we do business. So let's talk about some of the trends that we can see. First thing to say is that there was a period last year, wasn't there, where lots of people went home on furlough, didn't want to do that, but did, and wondered how to occupy their times. At that point, the internet chatter on ethical hacking groups went up roughly fourfold. So a lot of people were getting into cyber for good reasons or bad, and sometimes, sadly, bad. We've seen a lot of new hackers from home. So organized crime groups used to be where it's at. Some of those have folded now. Let's think Maze, they've published their methodologies, and others have sprung up in a really entrepreneurial way to offer things like ransomware as a service. So if you want to procure a website, a methodology, understand the tools, then all this kind of stuff is being democratized. And for pretty small amounts of money, you can buy your way into how to launch a hack. There's a definite move towards businesses and away from individuals, A, because it's a juicier target, and B, because actually the business market at the moment is a fairly insecure one. I think I saw a survey fairly recently from information security professionals in the UK who suggested that something like a third of their staff had been given training on cybersecurity as part of the move towards home working. So 2 in 3 hadn't. And I think more than that, something like 50% of those people were enabled and quite happily encouraged to do online shopping on their work-based devices and to play games on those devices too. Although interestingly, 60% of them then were blamed if things went wrong. So didn't feel like a great picture, but certainly, you know, for Joe Average and Joanna Average at home now, we're not a lot wiser about cybersecurity than we were. We regard it as a company-based issue, and yet the company structures are very much more vulnerable. So Q4 last year, top 10 email subjects for phishing related to corporate policy change. And we'll talk a bit more about some of the phishing stuff as I move on to the next slide. Ransomware increasing. So I think I'm right in saying, I'm just going to check my notes here. Yeah, that's right. 300% increase over the last year, NCSC will tell you about. So that's pretty significant, isn't it? But not just that. Actually, ransomware is getting nastier, more complicated and difficult. So it used to be, and I'm sure many of you know this, a fairly simple picture of pay me the money and I'll unfreeze your screen. Now what we're increasingly seeing is data exfiltration, where data is taken out of the systems. And there's a further threat that if it's not paid, that will be released, with the consequential reputational impacts, damage to business credibility, and something far longer lasting and more difficult. It's also being increasingly targeted towards high value firms. NCSC, as I say, dealt with 3 times the amount of ransomware reports last year. This suggests that they are moving towards big game hunting, if you will. In other words, that ransomware is moving into the area where the rewards are biggest. So you've got 2 parallel trends, really: democratization of the simple stuff, but specialism around ransomware particularly. What is interesting is that although the demands are getting much higher for money, those demands are being met less often, and particularly stateside, there had been a tendency for organizations to make those simple mathematical questions and decisions around the revenue they lost on a daily basis against the cost of making good the ransom demand. But we've moved very much away now, on the advice of governments and insurers, from paying, not least because actually very often those demands are being followed up by a second and a third demand. So there was no certainty around what you get for your money. And I think in the long term, that has to be a good thing, because, of course, what it means is criminal gangs no longer have the additional funding to simply expand in what's becoming something of an arms race. Phishing. Okay, so if I spoke about democratization, it's probably no surprise that phishing remains the most common vector of attack for businesses now. Significantly COVID health based during the first lockdown period, but significantly also, we're starting to see a lot more attacks now linked towards Microsoft and ways of working. So really interesting kind of example that I saw and shared on LinkedIn in the last week or so, where you might be asked to sign a remote document, and many people don't know what that process looks like. So they'll click through various screens, go through maybe a Google reCAPTCHA, which looks very official, be taken to something that looks like a company-based website, and then input their credentials and be given a document. But of course, it isn't a company website they've been directed to, and they've compromised their login details. So with that kind of easy methodology, that confusion around remote working, what we're seeing now is that 68% of these phishing emails have malicious links. Data entry forms and malicious documents, actually, less so now. It's no surprise, I think, against that context, that business email compromise is growing fast. NCSC cite this one. So in different terminology, we might talk about this as spear phishing, where a particularly targeted email is sent to somebody within let's say, an accounts department of a larger organization, and asking them to make an urgent payment. And the more credible we can make that, perhaps because we've got a foothold within the organizational accounts system already through the previous stuff that we've spoken about, the more likely that is to be paid. And you wouldn't be asking for small amounts of money there, would you? And unsurprisingly, criminals aren't. So the average cost is around £60,000, set against an average cost of around £3,000 generally for successful cyber crimes against a business. Good news, had to have somewhere, viruses and malware falling significantly. So there you go, there's a highlight to take away from the day. The complicated stuff we're seeing less of, but I wanted to end feeling a bit consistent with another negative. Vulnerabilities are massively on the increase and continuing to grow. It's a fairly constant trend. So I think this is an interesting figure. I would have run out of fingers a while ago, but 18,103 vulnerabilities disclosed through the last year. And what's really interesting is that there were more in the high and critical categories than across all categories a decade ago. And what I mean by those high and critical categories are the ones where effectively a breach results in the affording of admin user rights to some or all levels across the system. So what are businesses doing about it? Good news here. Businesses do see this as a key risk. This from the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors. 80% of them place it in the top 5. Might be slightly concerning that only 20% opt for climate change, but it does make you have a feeling of pink fuzzy warmth, I think, around the fact that larger businesses who have internal auditors take this seriously. Board engagement has increased accordingly. So something like 2/3 of boards now take a quarterly report or have an individual with a regular portfolio responsibility for cybercrime. And more businesses are carrying out cybersecurity risk assessments. But gosh, look at those figures, 35%. Seeking guidance, 54%. It just feels like we're nothing like there yet, from my perspective. And there is a move towards better understanding of the threat. So this aligns with some of the national picture. I could speak about the information sharing partnerships. I could speak about cyber alarm. We've already spoken about CERS and also CRCs, which I'll move on to in just a moment. The overview that I'm going to give you is cybercrime has become much more prevalent, much more simple, and much more successful. And it's still true to say that the business community has not fully moved into that space, particularly at the small business end. And this at a time when we're seeing that the safety of our supply chains is really crucial. A recent report, I think, spoke about probably 1 in 3 small businesses being likely to be sent under by a successful cyber attack, costing on average £3,100. So something needed to happen. And I'm going to talk to you for the last 5 minutes or so, very briefly, around the CRC concept, which is the area where I come in. So the Cyber Resilience Centre for the South West is part of a national network established under police chiefs across the country. It's supported by Home Office funding, and it's a policing private partnership, really importantly, because police officers don't know what's going on well enough in the cyberspace. And actually, nor does the private sector. We need to collaborate on this. And this is why cyber alarm and CISP and the various other things that we've already mentioned. We are here really importantly as a not-for-profit company, so we're not looking to make money out of things. But where we differ from the existing and really strong police provision in this area is that because we're on a business footing, we can provide services direct into businesses. So in the same way that at the moment, I couldn't tell you what kind of door lock to fit as a serving officer or who a good locksmith might be, actually on a business footing, I can do that. And that's really, really important in the cyberspace, because if I can't tell you how to protect your business and your digital front door from being broken down, then you can't take that discussion any further. So people need to be led through by the hand to show them what they have to do and who can help them do it. So our free offer, so I'm kind of wanted to hawk this one for those of you that have small businesses and may find this relevant. Our free offer is open to all businesses across the Southwest and charities across the Southwest. And what we do with this is, first of all, we are unique in having an MOU with the NCSC to share their simple, plain English advice. And we will give that to companies signing up, and we'll say, look, here are the steps towards cybersecurity. Here's what good looks like. We'll speak with them and make sure that's gone okay. And on a monthly basis, we'll give them an update on new scams and new protection. We'll also put on free webinars to talk them through key topics with some of our partners. And if they need something a little bit more, then we are there to hold their hand and signpost them. So key messages for us. Gosh, they're not particularly tough, but I started out by saying I'm not a cyber expert. So the piece is not for me to talk about firewalls to people, but they're to get them up to that basic level of cyber hygiene. And it's very much in the space of cyber essentials, I guess. So what do we do if you want something a little bit more? Because that generic stuff is great, but there's some really interesting collaborations through which we can bring a bit more to businesses. The first thing is that we have partnerships with universities across the region, and through using current ethical hacking students, insured, working to a scheme of work, and under the supervision of really experienced cybersecurity professionals, we can provide a number of additional services into a small business that probably otherwise wouldn't engage with cybersecurity because they'd see it as prohibitively expensive, or because, frankly, they might not trust a provider, but they probably will trust a not-for-profit policing organisation. And I often describe us as the thin end of the wedge, if you will, which starts to switch people onto this level of awareness and brings them a more tailored understanding of their risk. Once they've got past this, of course, they might well want to do a little bit more. And this is where we start to move them into the existing cyber landscape. So we have partnerships with a number of partners across the area. There you go, a couple of those sponsors for the day and even on the agenda for the day. These companies for us are great ones to work with because they are accredited to deliver that stamp for Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus at a local level. So for us, there's a really clear line of sight between NCSC, IASME, and actually a company that knows its onions. So I think that ability to take a small business through a process from really simple guidance to bespoke advice towards commercial services in a way that they know is trustworthy is a really positive one. And actually, although there are areas where I think it's fair to say when I was having these conversations with the cybersecurity cluster at the outset, we scratch our heads and think, gosh, are we treading on each other's turf here? The reality is probably not. I think what we're doing is growing the market for those who would not otherwise engage. So that, ladies and gents, is about it from me. I think we're up on time. So I'm going to hand back to Robin and look forward to hearing from you for questions in the next session. Thank you.